So like Amber said, I used to be a South Dakotan. It was actually this weekend was my 5th year anniversary of moving to Texas. So seems like just yesterday, but a lot has happened since then. So like she said, I taught family consumer sciences in South Dakota for 7 years and then moved down here to work on my doctoral degree. And I actually had the pleasure of teaching at a high school here in Texas as well. And I can tell you that there's a couple things that I learned from that experience is, first of all, kids are kids wherever you go. It was pretty amazing to me how I went from a high school with a couple hundred students to a high school that had almost 3,000 students in the building, and the kids were the same. The culture was different, but it was much the same as behavior issues and things like that. But one of the things that was different is I started realizing how many resources are out there and how many opportunities for learning that there are. I also learned that a lot of times in urban settings, kids don't necessarily have the same learning opportunities that those in rural settings have. So I have since kind of really dove into that idea of what does that mean, and how can I curate learning opportunities for students no matter where they are, whether they're in landlocked South Dakota or they're down on the coast or the Rio Valley of Texas, or here in Lubbock, which happens to be cotton country. We're the cotton capital of the world here in Lubbock, Texas. So, but how do we curate or create experiences that students can be exposed and can learn outside of what they know in their own little town? So that is kind of where this idea came from today, and kind of our starting off point here. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see, and get this started. See if this works. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to present. Okay, so it's a virtual wild world is the title of this presentation. So if you'd like to follow along with me, I'll give you just a second. You can actually use your smartphone. If you have an Apple or an iOS phone, you can actually just open up your camera and scan this QR code and it'll take you right to this presentation. Otherwise, I'll share the link at the very end where I'll drop it in the chat box so that you can have this information too. And then this presentation actually links to all the resources that I'm going to be sharing with you today. And I have actually uploaded all the resources to that conference folder as well. So a couple different ways for you to get this, but I'll give you just a minute to do that if you would like.
Kristie, I don't think it's open. I needed to request access.
Oh, let me change that really fast. Sorry about that. Okay, try that again. If not, I'll change it at the end. Should have anyone on the internet can view this link. Did that work?
We're good now. Yep,
okay,
thank you.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for letting me know. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started here. Okay, so what I really want you all to think about is curating experiences. So designing experiences for your students. And a lot of times this takes some time and some effort and some thought and some practice. And so these are a few questions that I like to ask is, what is the learning opportunity here? And so I currently work with student teachers. I'm the supervisor for the student teachers here at Texas Tech. And that's the question that I always ask them. Like, it seems really fun, but where's the learning in it? And so I think that that's the big question is, just because it sounds cool and it sounds trendy, is it really a learning opportunity? So the example I always give my students is find me a standard that connects to toilet paper wedding dresses. That's something we see in the FCS world all the time being shared. So find me the standard that my students are actually going to be learning from that, and it's not just a fun activity. And so I would challenge you to do that as well. I think that there is some learning opportunity in toilet paper wedding dresses, but you have to curate that experience. You can't just say, make me a toilet paper wedding dress and expect the students to learn from it. So you have to really dig in and you have to decide, what is that learning opportunity? And then the next question that I think should be asked is, what is the industry that could be introduced here? And this is a really big question, because there's generally, any topic that you are teaching, especially in CTE, there's a lot of different industries that can be tied. And so I'll show you an example here in just a minute that I've been having some fun with, that connects lots and lots of different industries, lots of different areas within CTE. And then the next question is, where is that industry located? Is that something that is right here in your hometown that you can easily go visit? Or is that something that is maybe not accessible to you as far as field trips, guest speakers, things like that? When they are accessible, of course, it's a lot easier to curate these experiences. But as geographically you get further and further away, oftentimes it's harder to curate those experiences. So after you've kind of thought about those connections, you have to create your resources to be able to get into them. So the big question is what resources are already out there? So don't reinvent the wheel. Beg, borrow, and steal. I think in CTE, we're really good about that. Oftentimes there are resources already developed that you don't actually have to do the work. And I'll show you some of those resources that I've been finding and digging. I would say within the last 2 to 3 years, the industry has kind of blossomed in that they are finding ways to promote their businesses on social media through different mediums. And so we'll kind of talk about that in a minute. And then who's willing to connect with you? I think that this is one thing that COVID has done for us, is it has opened up this conversation. And so in order to keep jobs open, in order to keep business flowing, a lot of companies have had to shift. And I have been seeing a ton of different webinars and resources that companies are putting out. And so now is the time to kind of jump on this and to start asking, who do you have at your company that could come and talk to my students? And then how do you find those resources and connections? And we'll talk about what has been successful for me. And how do you ask, and what do you ask for when you are trying to create connections for your students? So that's kind of the big questions and the big things that I think need to be answered as you're starting to make connections for virtual learning opportunities. All right. Okay. So what is the big takeaway here that you're curating? So is it a career opportunity? And a lot of times you want to think through this before you do the ask. So then that way you're prepared for what you need to ask for. So if you are trying to curate some kind of career opportunities for your students, allow them to learn more about what those options are within the industry, that's something you should specifically ask for. Maybe it's a STEM-based question that you want your students to understand the science behind what someone does in their job, or the engineering that goes into it. So be prepared to specifically ask for those kinds of questions when you do go to curate these opportunities. And then lastly, I think exposure is just really important. I know I have never lived along a coastline. However, when I moved to Texas, one of the things that I had to teach was Gulf fishing. I am in Lubbock, Texas. That is nowhere near the coast. In fact, I did the math, and it's actually closer to go to San Diego, California, than it is to get to the coast of Texas, even though I live in the same state. So it's about the same distance if I were to drive from Lubbock to South Dakota versus Lubbock to the coast. So, but I still have to teach that. I still had to teach that. It was still part of my standards. And often students here in Lubbock, Texas have never eaten seafood, much the same as my South Dakota students had never eaten seafood. And so a lot of times it was just exposure and finding connections down on that coast that could help expose my students to what fishing and what those standards meant. So when you're making the ask, make sure you're making those connections. Okay, so, and then what part of the industry are you introducing? Is it production, so some kind of factory line? Is it the design behind it, whether it's the design of the product, the design of the factory, the design of the building, whatever you're introducing? Transportation is a big one that students find really interesting, and I think is a huge one, is how does one product get from one place to a next? How does the design of the transportation work? What is the logistics behind that? There's tons of careers just in that area. The marketing and sales of that product. And then, of course, where's the industry located geographically? And then what is the connection to your local culture? And this can be harder to do, especially if you're trying to introduce oyster farming in Lubbock, Texas, or Webster, South Dakota. But there are some connections you can make about when you're traveling and hospitality, things like that. And then exposure to outside industries. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more of the actual resources. So resources for connecting to industry. These are some of the ones that I have found and have found to be successful. So the first one is going to be virtual field trips. If you start looking around, there are tons of virtual field trips. One thing that I have found that a lot of virtual field trips are aimed at that elementary age. Now that can be challenging, and it can be something that may sway you from not engaging into that virtual field trip. However, this is another thing that I am seeing through COVID is that a lot of places, museums, industries are shifting to doing more virtual field trips. And then it's all about how you curate that experience once again. So if you just use the resources that are available for there, even though they're elementary, you're probably not going to find a lot of success. But if you take the actual field trip and kind of curate your own experience, I've had some success with that. Virtual museums are wonderful. If you haven't checked out the Smithsonian museums, almost all of them have some kind of virtual learning component. And so be sure you just go to the Smithsonian museums. Each one of those museums has their own website. And within the website, there's teacher resources and there's actual virtual exhibits that you can go look at. I know in Family Consumer Sciences, there's a whole entire exhibit about Julia Child and Julia Child's kitchen, which happens to be in the American History Museum, I think. And so you can actually see all parts and pieces of her kitchen. You can click on different links that take you out to some of her shows and some of the things that she has done. And each museum has those virtual exhibits like that. And so while you might not be able to take your students to Washington, D.C., it's something that you can still expose them to. National Geographic has tons and tons and tons of resources out there. And I'll dive into that a little bit deeper and show you a few of the actual connections that I have found. But there's actual events that they host that feature careers from across the world of people doing different things that you can actually sit in on live conversations with. And you can schedule those into your day, or you can watch the recording of those conversations. You can send in questions to ask the professionals. It's pretty cool. I'll show you that here in just a second. And then the next one on here is podcasts. I'm pretty sure everyone in my life is tired of me saying, oh, I was listening to this podcast, because this is something that I'm absolutely obsessed with right now, is finding podcasts to talk about just about any subject. So I will share some resources with you of what I have been doing with podcasts. But I've had a lot of teachers this summer ask me about, okay, you say podcast, but how do you integrate those? So I'll show you some of my favorites and some of the ways that I'm starting to develop some curriculum to use podcasts in my classroom. But just think about the different genres of podcasts. Just about anything that you can think of, there's probably a podcast for it. And you can really, really get lost in this world. So what I challenge you to do when you're looking at podcasts or you're listening to podcasts, think about very specific topics that you could introduce information with a podcast, or that you could start a conversation with, and then kind of go from there. And then, of course, the old standby videos and documentaries. This is always a good way to expose your students to different ideas. This is actually how I started developing that oyster lesson that I mentioned, that I had to teach the standards to, of how do you of oyster farming and production in Texas. And so I found a few videos of actual oyster farmers, what that meant, and then a few people cooking with those oysters, and how you integrate them, or how it's integrated into the culture of some communities in South Texas. So of course, there's tons and tons of videos, documentaries, and I'm sure you've already used that. And then the next one on here is Nepris. If you haven't used Nepris, it's a really, really cool tool. And I will show you this actual website. This Nepris is free right now, or most of its resources are free. It is a paid subscription website normally, but they're doing a ton of free stuff right now to the shift to virtual learning. But Nepris is essentially a collection of industry-based individuals who have produced videos, who have done Q&A sessions with classrooms in just about every industry that you can imagine. And so some of it is very local. I was perusing on there and I found some insurance agents actually from South Dakota that had produced a video and uploaded it to Nepris. There have been people I've seen on here, some cotton farmers I saw from Lubbock, Texas on this Nepris website. So if you search, oftentimes you can find connections right to your own home state, maybe even your own home community. So we'll dive into Nepris here in a second. And then the last thing I put on here, of course, is it's a who you know world. So who you know is often your very best resource. And so thinking about who are your friends from college or from life that are out doing industry jobs. A lot of times they have some outreach requirements in their positions. And so it's as simply as asking them to participate, and I'll show you some ways that I have done that have been successful. So those are the resources we're going to go over. Does anybody have any questions? I feel like I've been talking a ton here. Just give a second. If you have any questions, please stop me and feel free to ask.
Or you can put it in the chat too, and I'll monitor that.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna first take a look at some of the resources I have found for virtual field trips, and I'll show you how I have used them. So I'm gonna actually stop my share here. Actually, I probably shouldn't have done that. Sorry, sometimes this Zoom technology gets the best of me here. So, okay, so reshare, here we go. So this is a resource that I put together. If you just click on the picture I had in my PowerPoint, this will take you right to it. This is a Wakelet, which is a really cool resource that I have just found. It's kind of like a digital corkboard, but it's super easy to use. So I have put on here a collection of different places that offer virtual field trips and some ideas for it. And so I won't go through all of these, but this one I thought was really cool. Here's Excel Energy, has a virtual power plant tour that you can take your students on. You can learn more about power plants. They even have some worksheets and some stuff already developed. I took a look at those. Some of them are pretty low level, but you could definitely use that as a jumping off point. So when I say curate your experience, this is exactly what I'm talking about, is find ways for your students to connect to that actual tour. So it has some interactive pieces here, and it's already pre-developed. And so when you click on it, it's actually, oh, I don't have enough flash, but it actually shows you the inside workings of a power plant, and your students can click through it and take a look at it. So that's just one of them that I've pulled up here. Here's a virtual egg farm tour that I found that the American Poultry Association, or the egg board, has. And I like this one because they kind of have it sorted by different age groups. And they do have some higher level videos in here, and it shows all different kinds of egg production facilities. It shows small farms up to huge major factory farms. And it shows you how those differ, how they sell their product. So there's just tons of different ways that you could connect this here. Let's see, this is another really good one, Google Arts and Culture. This changes every single day. They add new things. So here's one from Asia that talks about food in Asia. And it just kind of talks about what that culture looks like, what's happening, what's new and interesting in those different areas. A lot of art-based things here, but also, you know, food is art. So if you're teaching any kind of foods classes, any kind of design classes would be really interesting. They have a lot of stuff. Like I said, it changes every single day as to what they offer here. So Google Arts and Culture is a good one. And then there was one more I was going to show you. Let's see. Oh, the Met Museum. This is really good if you're teaching any kind of fashion or design classes. They have tons of interactive art exhibits here. The Christian Dior collection is here. I had a student that actually took this and made a really, really cool virtual field trip document. So if anybody wants that, I can ask her to share that with us. But she took all these Christian Dior different exhibits, and she created like a experience where students had to go in and do some virtual designing and virtual storyboarding and such. So Chanel is in here. The Met is a really good one. Their exhibits also are changing pretty often, so it's a really good one to check back with. And then this one's really cool. This has stock images of cities from around the world. So it's the largest collection of stock images that you can explore. So now that I'm not in the classroom anymore, but I think that I would have introduced this when we were talking about some of those coastal issues, that a lot of my landlocked Lubbock kids had never been down to the coast. It's a long ways, and so this would have been a chance for us to actually look at Houston and down in the Gulf area, for them to actually see what the difference is culturally. Just lots of really cool, good 3D imagery that you could create and experience. So those are some of the resources I have posted here. This one's a good one too. This one has all the national parks. It has virtual tours that you can take in all of those. So all of these are free. You don't have to pay a subscription to any of these. And so once again, it just goes back to asking those questions of what's the experience that I'm really trying to dive into for my students, and how am I really trying to reach them, and what's the learning opportunity here. So I'm gonna go back to, can you see my PowerPoint? Did it follow me? Okay, cool. All right, so that's virtual field trips, virtual museums. The next one is a few more so what do you do with this? I keep talking about curating these experiences. So a couple of them that I have found, there is a museum called the Exploratorium. I can't even tell you where this museum is, but it's a very hands-on museum. And so what I have done is it discusses several different things within the Exploratorium. So for example, I created a unit on food preservation. And one of the things we talked about in food preservation was pickling. It's a very trendy thing right now. If you go to any fancy restaurants, they always have their fresh pickles, fresh vegetables pickled on the menu as an appetizer. And so this is something we wanted to explore. So I found that Exploratorium website. And so I went ahead and I created a document that guides the students through their learning. So on that document, let me find it again. Close some of these. Nope, that's not it. Sorry. Here we go. Okay, so on that document, it just guides the students through the actual learning. So they have to explore this website, find out what is pickling, what kind of pickling could you find from the different parts of the world, what's the difference between pickling and fermentation, what's kimchi, so on and so forth. And so when you look at this website, it guides them through all of this. It gives you some recipes and some activities, fermentation and food, a brief history of ketchup, and then they even have some little like fun interactive things that you can do. Which once again my flash is blocked. But so the whole point is I wanted them to start thinking about pickling and start thinking about what that means, and much more than just pickles on our hamburgers, and just showing that there's different cultural aspects. So this was one way that I curated that learning experience for them and guided them through that. And then as you can see here, candy, I've developed something for that. When we talked about candy units, when we discussed breads, I created another kind of learning guide here. And the cool thing about these is they actually have lollipop factories that you can learn about. And it shows the process of how this candy is made, what goes into it. There's a fudge one where it shows a fudge factory and paddling of that on marble tables. And so it just continues on and on. And so it's not something that we could go visit. We didn't take the time to do that, but it was a quick explanation for them diving into the candy part. Okay. And so sometimes I would take grades on this. Sometimes it was just a discussion. It depended upon what the goal was for the unit. So a lot of times this is what replaced me lecturing. And so it was kind of that flipped classroom idea where they had to discover this on their own. And then we had a discussion about what that meant. And then a lot of times from there, they had the choice of how they wanted to implement pickling into our labs. So. Another one here is the Best Made Pickle Factory, which is a type of pickle that's made here in Texas. It's out of Fort Worth, and it is king here. People love their best made pickles, and so this was something that I for sure wanted to incorporate. And so I explored their website, and I found on their website they actually have a little factory tour. Once again, flash is blocked here, but there's little videos that go through each step of the process, from literally how they select the seeds for their cucumbers to how they put those cucumbers in the ground, how they harvest those cucumbers, what they do when they get to the factory, how they transport it out, how they sell it, how they develop their marketing tactics. All those things goes into that. And so I simply just made a little a little guide. It goes step 1, step 2, step 3 in the tour. And so as the students are watching the tour, they just had to jot down information. So once again, this was a really good starting off point for conversations. And it kind of started that whole topic of how do they harvest things, how do they produce things, and how do we mimic that in our own labs and in our own kitchens? Where are our job opportunities, career opportunities there? So that was a part of my pickling unit. So I did a few more things and we'll explore those. Okay, so here I wanted to stop and show you this National Geographic site that I mentioned before. I think that there's just so many opportunities here for learning. So if you go to just National Geographic into the education part, it shows you all kinds of different opportunities here. So these Explorer Classroom broadcasts, they're live events every Wednesday and Thursday. And so you can actually sign up for your classroom to view them. And if not, you can actually watch them after the fact if you don't want to watch them live. But you can send in questions to ask these people before the broadcast happens, and they'll address your questions that your students might send in. So the topic changes every single week. They have a new person. Sometimes it's designers and architects from across the world. Sometimes it's farm engineering, people in third world countries. It's just been really interesting to watch the different topics that they have. So this week, Antarctica is what they're focusing on, and they'll go into what their job entails, how they got to that job, what kind of career, preparation they needed, what kind of internships they did. And so these are very, very, very informational for students that might be interested into those careers. So you can actually look ahead and see what's coming up. So if there's something that you're interested in, it'll show you that. It will also give you the recommended ages. And that's because a lot of times these people they're using actual terminology and they're using the verbiage that's part of their career. So a lot of times it's some kind of higher level conversations. So you can see here what's happened and what has come up. The other thing that's really cool is they have challenges on here that you can set for your students. They're kind of in a lull right now because of it being summer, but a lot of times throughout the school year, they have a lot of really cool challenges posted. So take action and home in their community. So I think that people teaching family consumer sciences, this would be a great way to discuss families and different cultures. Anyone teaching any kind of STEM-based classes, this would be really cool challenge to have your students do and participate in. And then they also have some professional development for teachers, some online courses that teachers can take. Some of these are pretty low cost. Some of them are kind of expensive, so you kind of have to look through and kind of decide what works from there. So.
Kristie, we just got a question. Does National Geographic archive their programs, or is it only available to register for the live presentation?
So they do archive it. I don't know exactly how long it's available on here. I was trying to figure out that, but I do know that you can watch it after the fact. I've went back and watched some of them. So I think if you just go click on here and dive more into their YouTube page, I think that you can find some of those archived. But like I said, I haven't been able to find them easily here. So I will follow up on that though. If I figure it out, I will let you know. I know that they're available right afterwards because there was one a couple months ago that I tried watching and I missed it because I didn't watch the time correctly. And I was able to watch it right afterwards. So I'm sure they're archived somewhere, but I just haven't figured out exactly where. So I will add that to this PowerPoint if I find it. So, okay. So National Geographic, tons and tons of opportunities here for teachers, students, and I think really all across all content areas in CTE. Okay, the next one I have on here is podcasts, and this is the one that I'm most excited about and, and have been spending a ton of time developing. So podcasts, like I said before, there's just a podcast for just about every topic you can possibly imagine. And so this is a resource that I've put together of some of the podcasts that I have found, some of the ones that other teachers have shared with me, some of the things that, and these are just some of the areas in CTE. There's tons more here. But a lot of times, each one of these podcasts has episodes that could reach across genres. So stuff you missed in history class, I'm going to put in a plug for this one. This one was really exciting. Earlier this summer, they actually did the history of home economics. And so that was something I hadn't really learned a lot about until I started my doctoral degree. But if you didn't know that Ellen Swallow Richards was the person that started home economics and now Family and Consumer Sciences, and she actually was one of the very first women to go to MIT, and they actually never granted her a degree because she was a woman. And so it's a really, really cool history dealing with chemistry and how truly home economics was a science when it first was born. And so this podcast talks about that. It also talks about the practice houses and the practice babies that Family Consumer Sciences had in the history. And then it goes into tons and tons of other different topics. There was Irish slaves a few weeks ago, and just about anything you can imagine as far as different aspects of history. So this one's a really good one if you're trying to bring in a historical perspective to your different classes. There was one about Cannery Row that I totally would develop and add to my food preservation unit if I was still in the classroom. This one is probably my favorite, and I'm going to show you how I developed and how I curated a learning experience with this podcast. So I found a podcast. I was just listening to 99% Invisible is the name of this podcast. They have a couple different episodes every week. And one of the ones that stuck out to me was how to pick a pepper. This was featured last summer, I think, last fall, and it was really interesting because this is a definite cultural thing that happens in Lubbock, Texas. About this time of year, every year, we have these big roasters that roll into town. And they bring in New Mexico green chilies, and they actually do like fire roasted chilies in parking lots, and you can go buy them by the case and by the pounds. And so really interesting, delicious. Anytime you're in New Mexico, always order green chili. It's so good. But I did not know that this was such a controversial world. And so this podcast talks about how, first of all, the governors of New Mexico and Colorado got into a war of words trying to say who had the better green chilies. And so they actually started like a chili festival, and they had chili taste off. And so that was kind of the fun part of it. But what was really interesting is that chili production is actually really down because of a couple things. One of the major things being is that chili peppers can only be harvested by hand. And so they are trying right now at New Mexico State to develop a machine that can actually harvest chili peppers. But they're having lots of engineering issues because of the anatomy of a pepper bush. Peppers grow really low to the ground, and the fruit is inside the canopy of the plant. So when they build a machine, all it does is rip apart the plant. So this is one thing that the podcast talked about. But another issue is they always had migrant farmers to come and pick the peppers. And right now, there's all kinds of new immigration laws that have prevented migrant farmers from coming to New Mexico. So the statistics in here say that in 1997, there was over 30,000 acres produced and harvested of chili peppers. And in 2019, there was only 8,400. And so it's just definitely something that I did not know that there was such controversy over. And so I decided that I wanted to go ahead and develop this into some kind of learning experience. I thought it was so interesting. And so I went to the website, and when you go to the website for a lot of these podcasts, you can see that there's lots of other information that they have linked here. So there's videos, there's pictures, there's different stories, there's readings, there's all kinds of stuff that goes along with this episode. And each episode has this. And so what I have done is I went ahead and I created a kind of a learning guide here. So just some basic stuff here after watching the videos, what's your 3 major takeaways? But on top of that, I also found a lot of different resources that could link to some of those different issues within chili pepper production and farming. So here I found a whole bunch of articles, laws, websites that link to migrant farmers. So what is a migrant farmer? I didn't really know what the definition of that was, or what the rules were behind that, or what kind of visas those people need in order to come and work in the United States. And so I found a bunch of articles that talk about this. I found the actual laws that talk about the different visas. And so this is an area where students could really go and explore more about the topic of migrant farming. I'm going to put in a plug for another resource that a lot of you probably have used before, but Newsella, or I've heard it pronounced different ways, but Newsella is a website that you can go to and you can search by topic, and they have vetted articles that you can actually select the reading level that you would like to present this information at. So this one is for middle to high school students, but if I was logged in, I could actually change it if I was teaching elementary school or if I wanted it at a higher level. And it's all from reliable, good sources. You can also change it into Spanish for any of your ESL students that you have. Almost every article has that option to go from English to Spanish. And then it also has, a lot of them have quizzes and different things that go with it. So that's a kind of a side plug for Newsella if you haven't ever seen that. So running out of time here, but back to creating learning experiences with podcasts. So I picked the 3 areas that I thought really represented issues that students could explore within this podcast. And I created those reading guides, or those cork boards that the students could read further. And then of course you could have them do some kind of public presentation, some kind of product with those topics after the fact. And then I also went ahead and did a listening guide for this actual podcast so that the students could fill that out along the way. But I really think that this is an area that you could really develop, and you could really implement industry practices and laws and rules and regulations to help clarify any information that students might have about preconceived notions or ideas. And podcasts are a great way to introduce things that are maybe not geographically close to you. So I could go on and on and on about podcasts, but I will spare you, and we'll move on. The next resources were just videos and documentaries. Of course, this one I didn't dive into a lot because I think that this is something that we as CTE teachers do a really good job of already. But of course, YouTube, the History channel has tons of free resources on it, free videos, even some already developed some guides and some activities based on different aspects. And then PBS, if you are not a subscriber to the PBS app, I highly recommend it. It's the best $5 I spend a month, because then that gives you access to all kinds of different, all the PBS shows and documentaries that you could ever want. The last bit that I was going to show you about my pickling unit, and I included in the resources guide, is I actually created a viewing guide for a show called A Chef's Life, which is on PBS, where it is, she and her husband own a restaurant in one of the Carolinas. I can't remember which one, but it goes through, they do farm to table cooking practices in each one of their episodes, and she dives into the actual production of all the food that they use, and then how they implement it into their actual restaurant. And so this is a way that I have kind of used a more interesting video in my classroom. So we watched this when we were about ready to go make pickles. Okay, and then the last one is NEPRIS, and this one is probably got the most information. NEPRIS is something I have just kind of discovered. Like I said, right now, a lot of their things are free, but usually it is a subscription that you need to pay for. But NEPRIS provides all kinds of videos, readings, things like that, to teachers and to educators. And so as you can see here, they have over 39,000 industry professionals. They've had over 10,800 different live sessions. Much like the National Geographic, you can sign up for actual live sessions where industry professionals will be discussing what they do. Some of the ones that I have listened to, just because I was curious, there was a couple designers that were talking about vehicles that could fly, that they're working on the design of that. And they were talking about different like how they would design roads up in the air for these flying aircrafts. And they're these crazy aerospace engineers that were just sharing what they do on a normal day. So pretty cool. You can kind of look here how it works. You can actually schedule chats over different topics. You can request a virtual guest speaker for your classroom. Really cool tool. I have a colleague that has been involved with NEPRIS for a while, and she actually gets contacted to talk all the time in classrooms. She's a family consumer sciences professor as well, and so she has a profile on here saying that she's willing to talk to classrooms, so teachers contact her and ask her to come and talk about what it means to be a professor and a professor of teachers. So pretty cool. They have an archive of videos that you can watch. Like I said, this is the one I found. I think it was some insurance agents from South Dakota on here that had some pretty cool resources. So you can kind of dig around in this. This is there's tons and tons and tons of stuff in NEPRIS. I do just want to make it clear that it is free right now, but I do know it's kind of expensive resource otherwise. But I'm sure you could use Perkins funding and stuff if you had that. Okay, and then the last thing, I only have a couple minutes left here, is it's a who you know world. So think about who you know, who are your friends that you could invite in. So I've had a variety of people I had a friend who was dating a poultry scientist for a while, and so he Skyped into my classroom and talked to us what it means to be a poultry scientist. There's very few of those actually in the nation, and so he talked to us about how he got to where he was. I've had chefs come in. Even when I was in South Dakota, we've had some pretty amazing chefs that could come in and talk about what they do. This bottom one, the Minnesota Integrated Food Safety Center, I had a friend who was she was working on an internship called Team D, and they're the team that calls around to track foodborne illness outbreaks. And so they talked about what that means, how they do that contact tracing, and it just so happened when I had them, there happened to be a raw milk outbreak right near where the school was, and so she was able to tell us the details of that and how many people it affected and how they figured out where that outbreak came from specifically. So that was a pretty cool talk that I had. Those interns change all the time, but it was always a really good experience for them to talk to my students about foodborne illness. And then this one up here, the Royal Cup Coffee, I was at a professional development for culinary training in Birmingham, Alabama, and we got to tour this roasting facility. And so I just at the end of the tour, I asked the guy that was giving the tour, I said, would you mind Skyping in? Would you be interested in that? And he was more than happy to do that. And so he Skyped into my classes and talked about fair trade and how they picked the raw beans to be roasted for some of the top coffee in the nation. And so don't be afraid to ask. Like I said, a lot of times people are really excited to talk about what they do. And so just try to think about, as you're networking and as you're meeting to people, just collecting business cards and contact information. So I know I'm out of time here, but I just wanted to share this last couple slides with you. Any of the resources that I shared today are going to be linked to one of these websites. And then lastly, here is my contact information.